Hello. Once again, we will be discussing Common Works registration. Actually, it has been a while. If you want to start with CWR basics, follow the series linked above. In this video, I will start covering CWR parts of my music metadata software library. Parts of it are already released as open source, the rest will follow as we gather more sponsors. Let me explain the concept. I am creating this library. For every part I write down the costs of development. Companies who want to use it, pinch in. They can use all of it at once. As development costs get covered, I release parts of the library as open source code, under MIT license. The library is spread out over several repositories, the URL is here. And in the description, of course. Why is this important? Why is it covered so early in the series about Music Publishing Administration (SAS)? Does it not go somewhere much later? Actually no. I have been consulting on many projects that tried to implement CWR. Well, in most cases, to integrate it in whatever they had at the time. If you start too late, it gets messy. Very messy. The only good way to do it is to plan it from the start. Let us have a look at a CWR registration example. The first line contains information about the musical work. There is much more information to the right. Here we can see the title and the internal work ID. The last 4 lines are for writers. Carmen is controlled, so there are 3 lines. Tuning is not, so only a single line. Everything else is data about controlled publishers. 21 lines, which is just enough to make the point, as it only contains sub-publishing information for 6 territories. It is this part that brings most of the headache, even if everything checks out. But it often does not. Some of the required data is missing or corrupt. This was a relatively small registration example. They often have hundreds of lines, with thousands of fields, each field a single piece of information. Much of it is required, and if you don't have it, then you cannot make a valid registration. Anyway, when designing a software solution that might eventually implement CWR, it is better to make it CWR compatible while on the drawing board. What does this mean? Well, CWR has tons of validation rules. For example, names can contain only these characters. You can also allow lowercase letters, as they can always be converted to uppercase. But you should not allow commas in names. Or that authors of original musical works can only have one of these roles. Arrangers, adapters, translators, etc., can only exist in modifications. It goes on, and gets weirder. This compatibility has 2 parts. If your data structure is not compatible, then your imports will be partial and lossy, and your exports will be often faulty. If only your data is incompatible, then the exports will be faulty as well. Garbage in, garbage out. Validation of the incoming data, regardless if through imports or manual input, is crucial. Data structure is beyond this video. Or any one video. Getting it right is the most demanding part of designing music publishing administration software. Getting it wrong can be extremely costly. We will not make our data structure public, and even reverse engineering will be very hard. Of course, you can pay the subscription and give it a go. However, when it comes to data, we will not hold back. Common Works registration is based on EDI, Electronic Data Interchange. The link to a Wikipedia page is in the description. But, it is not the only music metadata format in use, based on EDI. So, I made an EDI base in a separate repository. CWR and CRD, all versions, inherit from it. Let us have a look at the Python files. Generally, structure is always the same. Fixed width fields are combined in records, which are basically rows. Rows are grouped in transactions, transactions of the same type in groups and groups in files. There is a file with errors, and a folder with tests. Let's start with fields. They are descriptors. This is the base class for all field classes. Its attributes are size and mandatority. The descriptor methods are pretty obvious. Let's scroll down. When we want to convert it to EDI format, we must add blanks at the end to have the right size, because we stripped the blanks and set. Let's move to records. Here are the meta class and the base class. The code is folded, check it in the repo if you want to dig in. A lot of magic happens here. Most notably, splitting into fields, with validation and parsing into ED format. Why we do it this way? So we can define the field simply. Here we define the record type, 3 characters long, at the beginning of every record. And then we can inherit from this class, as shown here, we simply list the fields. The magic of descriptors. We move to transactions. We use the same principle. For parsing, we detect the record type and then parse it. At the same time, we validate. We repeat it for groups and for the file. But, let's come back to CWR. We define the additional fields, like title field and name field shown here. Regex is checking for invalid characters in titles and names, mentioned earlier. There is a lot of experience in this code, like raising a warning or an error here. Note that this code is still not released as open source. In some cases, field mandatority depends on values of other fields in the same record. Here, we check if a non-controlled publisher without the name has unknown flag set. It should. If T does not, we raise an error. Some validations are performed at the transaction level, like the example I made earlier with writer roles. Here we check if writer roles check out for original works. If modification is false, no other roles except C, A and CA are allowed. Anyway, if you need something along these lines, pinch in and use it at once or wait until it is released as open source. Back to the SAS. Why is this important now? Well, here is SWR record, for controlled writers. Interested party number is required and only 9 uppercase alphanumeric characters long. That is well under 40 bits. We cannot use UUIDs. Last name is required, 45 characters long. Etc. etc. We have to consider this when we are designing the database. I am not saying that we have to follow this to the letter, we are most certainly not doing it all the time. But for writers, last name field is 45 and required. First is 30 and not. Complicated? We are just scratching the surface here. I am making these examples as simple as I can. This video is featured in 3 series, about the SAS, about CWR and the new one, about open source stuff. They are diverging now, but will converge later in the season. You may also be interested in DMP, it's open source and CWR compatible. I'll see you in the next video.